Well, what do you know? He's back. I have my mother, oddly enough, to thank for unearthing this particular discovery concerning my channel's breakout mascot. And I ain't gonna lie, it's a mind-bender. For all his many, many flaws, documented in excruciating detail in the eponymous playlist, see above, there is simply no denying that Tycho Brahe was one of the most diligent, assiduous, and painstaking scientists of his day. It is from his unparalleled astronomical observations that Johannes Kepler derived both his world-changing laws of motion and the Rudolphine tables of planetary ephemerides that remained in use for nearly 200 years. But it is not as an astronomer that I wish to discuss Tycho today, but as an alchemist. Alchemy gets a bad rap these days, largely because its practitioners, when not outright charlatans, tended toward the narcissistic, volatile, misfit personalities typified by Tycho and Isaac Newton. But even though they were largely flailing in the dark as far as genuine science is concerned, the alchemists still managed to lay much of the groundwork for modern chemistry, a word, let's not forget, derived from their profession. They developed distillation, created many of the tools, such as funnels, flasks, and couples, still used today, discovered 4 chemical elements, antimony, arsenic, bismuth, and phosphorus, and manufactured nitric acid, sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, and sodium carbonate, though their names for these substances were far more poetic. Alchemy was held back as a science by its heavy financial incentive. Because many alchemical goals were potentially massively profitable, not only the classic lead into gold, but also medicine and cosmetics, alchemists were extremely loath to share the discoveries with others, a prerequisite for scientific study. As such, while their theory, which is largely impenetrable pseudo-philosophical babble, has come down to us, their practice, which is where the actual advancements lay, is less present in the historical record. But where history ends, archaeology begins, and last week, in the journal Heritage Science, chemical analysis of shards taken from the ruins of Tycho's laboratory have not only shone a light on his alchemical works, but also, potentially, thrown a chronological wrench into the history of science. The Swedish team used laser spectroscopy to identify the chemicals on either side of the shards excavated from what was presumed to be Tycho's laboratory in the late 1980s. Presumed because his palace of the Self, Uraniborg, was, upon his exile from Denmark in 1597, dismantled by royal decree over the course of 50 years, to the point where not even his alchemical lab, which was in the basement, remained. According to his superhumanly exacting specifications, the lab comprised 16 ovens, each precisely designed for a specific task. There were, for instance, quote, 2 reverberatory furnaces, one of which reflected the heat directly, the other reflected along a spiral path, freely yet indirectly. When the lab was first excavated in 1824, only traces of the furnaces were found. Subsequent excavation of the surrounding area between 1988 and 1990 found traces of what appeared to be glass and ceramic flasks, possibly from the laboratory. Possibly because they were somewhat removed from the lab itself. However, it is difficult to imagine what else such clearly alchemical glassware on such a remote island could possibly have been. 5 shards, 4 of glass and 1 of ceramic, were chosen for the study. Of the materials found significantly enriched on their surfaces, most would not have surprised an alchemist. Tin, gold, lead, copper, antimony, and mercury. Mercury, the mystical liquid metal, had been a core of alchemy since its inception, while the recently discovered antimony, with its seemingly magical ability to expand when cooled rather than heated, was all the rage. And what did Tycho do with these marvelously toxic materials? Why, he made medicines out of them, of course. Yes, even mercury. His alchemical work appears to have focused on medicine, a discipline that in his day was even less advanced than alchemy. Of the few of his recipes we know, his elixir for plague, given to his patron Rudolph II, comprised, among many other things, opium, copper sulfate, drinkable gold, and powdered viper's flesh. Tycho saw little difference between his alchemical, medicinal, and astronomical work. Like many alchemists, he tied metals both to planets and to internal organs. The sun and moon, unsurprisingly, were tied to gold and silver and the heart and the brain. Mars, god of war, was tied to iron and, for some reason, the gallbladder. Mercury was tied to, well, Mercury, and the lungs, because Mercury was god of rhetoric? Maybe? Tycho did not consider himself an alchemist, describing his work as, quote, the pyronomic art. Indeed, he appeared to find the term, and its associated quest for gold, demeaning. Quote, supposing that someone by means of the art they call alchemy can imitate nature, he wrote. They are, after all, not able to make anything as good and lasting as nature itself. Only a very few have, as far as we know, succeeded, while the great majority have been disappointed and have, far too late, regretted after wasting much time, labor, and money. One wonders who those few were. Actually, it is possible one of them may have been Tycho, because on the inner surface of one of his beakers, at concentrations 36 times higher than the background rate, the team found an element that, frankly, should have been impossible. Not gold, but tungsten. So, I hear you cry? Don't they make really hard drills out of it or something? Well, yes, they do, but not before 1781, when it was first isolated. 180 years after Tycho's now legendary death. And speaking of that notable death, I think it precludes him having been a time traveler, as, had he already known of what his death would entail, he would have done his best to avoid it, to say nothing of the duel that cost him his nose. As to whether he, alone among the alchemists of history, achieved transmutation, I think I can rule that out too, as when his body was exhumed in 2010, forensics found no evidence of radiation poisoning. More likely, at least according to the team, he simply came across a tungsten-bearing mineral and misidentified it. I prefer to think he discovered it and didn't tell anybody. And speaking of that exhumation, the team made a rather macabre comparison between the findings on the shards and those found in Tycho's bones in 2010. They found that, like the shards, they were rich in alchemical fan elements like silver, gold, cobalt, and arsenic, but unlike the shards, and what I said in my earlier biography, actually somewhat deficient in mercury. Since mercury was found in the ceramic shard sample, that suggests that, unlike many in his time, Tycho was aware of mercury's toxic effects and took precautions when handling it, except when doling it out as medicine, presumably. Or he simply let his assistants deal with it. It seems fitting for Tycho that the one element found in excess both on the shards and in his body was gold. You don't get gold in your body by merely being rich. Not even by eating off gold plates with gold cutlery. You get it by ingesting gold as an elixir or a garnish. Edible gold is and always has been the gaudiest wealth display in the history of civilization. It is, in its most literal sense, flushing money down a sewer. And Tycho wondered why his king fired him.